Hello, and welcome to another episode of Mad Scientist Brewing Beer Education Series. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about using beer in cooking. So, what does cooking with beer add to a dish? Cooking with beer will concentrate the flavors of the beer since the liquid is going to be cooked off. This can be both good and bad depending on the beer and the cooking method. So, if you're cooking with a particularly bitter beer, like IPA, that bitterness is going to get concentrated in the final dish and may come off as too harsh to be enjoyable. If you're cooking with a really roasty stout, the concentrated roast flavor may come off as ashy or astringent and overall not really that pleasant. However, you can get some really nice toasty caramel flavor from cooking down beer that has residual malt and sugars that you concentrated. It can add sweetness and stronger malt flavor to a food dish. The key is starting with a beer that isn't already too extreme in any aspect so that when it's concentrated further, you would not get those unpleasant flavors. You also want to be aware that any volatile compounds like hop aromas from hazy IPAs or any esters or phenols from yeast, like in Belgian beers, will get lost in the steam as beer is cooked off. So the method of cooking is important to consider as well. So when looking at typical uses for beer in cooking, the most common use for beer is a substitute for other liquids as part of the cooking method or in making sauces. The most common one you've probably seen is making a beer batter to fry things like fish or onion rings. The maltiness from the beer is going to give the batter a touch of sweetness, and the carbonation will help make the batter very light and crunchy. Another way to use beer is in poaching, which involves submerging the food in beer at a relatively low temperature rather than a high temperature like you would to just boil it. This is good for really delicate foods like seafood, and a classic example is to poach mussels in a Belgian Geuze, which is a sour beer that balances the brininess of the shellfish. Another favorite of mine is to use beer as a replacement for water or broth in a stew, such as in Belgian's carbonade flamande, which is similar to a French beef bourguignon, but it uses the sour beer rather than red wine. For dessert, beer can find a place in replacing water to make a cake. An annual favorite of mine is to make stout cupcakes using Guinness Extra Stout, topped with Irish cream frosting, which I just did this past St. Patrick's Day. If you want to use beer at a lower temperature, you would want to do that if you're interested in using beer for recipes that have flavors that could get too concentrated from cooking, like with your IPAs that are very bitter or hop forward. So you can use those in recipes like sauces or dips. The citrusy flavors and aromas for pale ale can meld pretty well as part of a salad dressing, and beer cheese dip is another great go-to, especially since beer and cheese already pair really well together. If you take a nice brown ale or a German lager, that adds some great depth of flavor to a cheese dip. So these are just a few ways to consider using beer in cooking. I would suggest giving it a try if you are a cook. If you're not a cook, I suggest you learn to cook. It's a great thing to learn how to do, and it's just fun to get to try to pair uh, beer with different cooking methods. I got to do this a couple times last week because I made bangers and mash and made a red ale gravy with that nice Irish red ale that we covered last week and the Guinness Stout cupcakes that I mentioned. So go give it a try, and I will do that as well. So until next time, cheers.